Are some board games ghost-written? Did Donald X Vaccarino really invent deck building? And have the best board games already been made? I'm Adam Porter, I'm a board game designer from Wales, and in recent videos I've been going back into my channel and answering some of the comments that have been left under previous videos. And so in this video we're going to be doing exactly the same. Snakes and Ladders, or Chutes and Ladders for my American viewers, is based on an ancient Indian game. Created around 2,000 years ago, Moksha Patam was a morality game. The designer appears to have presented the game as a story of ups and downs, progress and setbacks, an allegory for life. Their primary focus was to educate and inspire. Engaging gameplay seems to have been less of a priority. This comment says, and yet, the most successful, still popular games, the ones that have withstood the test of time, tend on average to be older rather than newer. I'm gonna just take issue with that statement. Well, not take an issue with it, I think it's obvious, isn't it? Older games are likely to have stood the test of time better than newer games, which clearly haven't had the chance to stand the test of time. I wonder where we'll be in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. Will the big popular games that everyone knows and loves still be Monopoly and Scrabble and Frustration and God, I don't play any of these games. I can't even really remember what these popular games are now. Risk, okay, these games, will they still be the big popular games? I expect they'll still be around. That's my gut feeling. Will there be other games in the mix? Absolutely. I think Ticket to Ride will be in there. I think Pandemic will still be around. I mean, possibly Carcassonne might still be around. Dobble, that's still going to be about, isn't it? There are numerous modern games that are going to stick around. Wingspan's not going anywhere anytime soon, is it? There are new modern classics that have taken the modern aesthetic, taken the developments in game mechanisms that we've discovered over the last 20 or 30 years and incorporated them into the games. And I think those games will have staying power. So I think they just haven't had the chance to prove themselves as standing the test of time, but I think they will. That's my gut feeling. That's not to say that Monopoly and Scrabble and Risk and all the rest won't still be around. I think they probably will. So this commenter goes on, and as for the mainstream public, well, I hate to be the one to inform you, but Risk, Monopoly and Snakes and Ladders are still far more successful than games on the Board Game Geek Top 100 list. Yeah? Okay. This commenter is probably not the one to inform me. I mean, I am aware of this. I'm aware of sales figures. If that's what we're taking as the measure of success, which I think is a perfectly reasonable way of looking at success. But there is also success in terms of critical analysis and critical review, isn't there? I mean, things that sell really, really well aren't necessarily the best examples of that particular item, particularly in something like this. But yes, I fully accept that those games are selling better than the games on the Board Game Geek Top 100 list. Commenter goes on, because board games are not like video games. They don't become better with technology advancements. They're more like books. The best ones have already been written, and most new ones are derivative, and their only value is novelty factor. Okay, interesting. Are board games like video games, or are they like books? Do board games get better with technological advancements? I think it's hard to defend that argument that they're more like books. That's certainly not how I see it. Books are a very passive thing, aren't they? Books are something you sit and you read. And firstly, I would argue whether the best books have already been written. I mean, there are certainly fantastic books that have been written for over centuries, for sure, but there are still magnificent books that come out year after year, month after month, day after day. And I'm sure many of those books are equally as good as books that were written hundreds of years ago. We could argue that. I'm not a particular book reader, but books are a very passive form of entertainment, whereas board games, like video games, are a very active form of entertainment. We immerse ourselves in that game. We control the way that game works and the way that game moves. We choose what we do in that game. We drive that game forward. We create the narrative. We create the story as we play. So board games, I think, are more similar to video games. In terms of technological advancements, I assume the commenter means by this, video games get better and better because technology gets better and better. In board games, that's not necessarily the case, although I would say you look at board games produced now, just the beauty of them, the beauty of the components, the beauty of the artwork. I would say technological advancements certainly are pushing forward the craft of creating board games compared to what's gone before. But forget about that. Forget about the physical appearance of the games, purely in terms of the gameplay. Undoubtedly, we have learned year on year as designers how to make better and better games, more and more interesting decisions, how to cross these mechanisms over with each other to create exciting new dilemmas for the players, how to facilitate really interesting social interactions. And certainly that can lead to unwieldy complexity. And I think a lot of people who, lean back towards those more traditional games are fearful of the additional complexity of these modern games. And they're quite right. That doesn't necessarily make these games marketable and successful in terms of, a broad audience. But there are many, many, many thousands of modern games that are coming out that are really quite simple, just as simple as those traditional games, or even more so, and yet have really sophisticated, clever mechanisms and enable really fantastic, joyous social interactions and puzzles for the players that I think it's hard to argue that board games aren't improving as the years go by, as people discover new advancements in the art form of creating a board game. So I'm going to have to disagree with this commenter. I don't think the best games have already been made. I think we continue to create great games year after year. It can be harder to create something that's truly new and unique because so much has gone before, but fantastic games constantly coming out, and I don't doubt that some of the best games ever created are still to come. Every game needs to have just that little something that captures people's attention, whether that's consumers, purchasers, whether it's retailers, distributors, and most importantly, publishers. That's what they're looking for. With thousands of games being released every year, your game needs to stand out because it does something that's intriguing and engaging and potentially a little bit different to what's gone before. So that's what this video is all about, how to create an intriguing, engaging hook for your game. And the question is, having an established name in the industry sure helps a lot. Human ego aside, what do you think about bringing along another much more well-known board game designer? Not as in actually co-designing a game with them, but as in pitching the game to them first instead of a publisher and offering them a percentage of the royalties. So they can pitch it as a co-designer, increasing the likelihood of the game getting picked up and published and therefore making money. With books, it sure happens a lot, with many known authors not having written their books and having ghostwriters. So this question got me thinking, do ghostwriters exist in the board game world? Is it ever the case that the designer's name that's on the box was not actually the designer of the game? And we know that this does happen with books. Particularly where there's some sort of celebrity tie-in. So you might have a celebrity's name on the book, but we know they didn't really write the book. So for example, Katie Price is sadly a celebrity in the UK, and there's a series of books, novels written by Katie Price, but they're not actually written by Katie Price, they're written by somebody else entirely. Some celebrities are quite open about that, others are not. It certainly happens a lot with biographies where somebody will write an autobiography, but it's very clear that there is somebody else who has ghostwritten that autobiography. So for example, the recent autobiography by Prince Harry, which was called Spare, wasn't it? Well, I think it's one of the best-selling books of all time, or the fastest-selling books of all time. But of course, it wasn't actually written by Prince Harry. It was written by a ghostwriter, and everybody's very open about that, and the ghostwriter is very sort of prolific and well-known. Who is the ghostwriter for Prince Harry's biography? Let me have a look. So the ghostwriter for Prince Harry is J.R. Molinger, who is an American journalist, memoirist, and biographical ghostwriter. Okay, so it's not always a source of shame to have a ghostwriter, but does it happen in the board game world? Well, I can't think of many board games that have been created by celebrities. I can think of a couple. So certainly I've seen pop up on my Facebook feed from time to time board games created by Neil Patrick Harris, who played Barney in How I Met Your Mother. So he's got 2 games, one called Box 1 and one called Amazed, which look like they're games based around trivia, general knowledge, and riddles. They don't look like the most modern sort of board games. They look fairly mass market. Can I believe that Barney from How I Met Your Mother or Neil Patrick Harris made these board games? Yeah, I can. He probably did design those, and I can't imagine if you're reaching out for a celebrity to slap their name on the box that it would be Neil Patrick Harris. Although we do slap the name of a celebrity on any old box, don't we? So you get them on beers and whiskies and perfumes and so on. So if a celebrity can attach themselves to those because they think they're going to make money, we don't believe that Kylie Minogue is really out there, you know, creating her own perfume, not brewing beer in their cellar, right? These is just a celebrity's name stuck on a product. Who knows? I haven't got any insight into whether Neil Patrick Harris was involved in the creation of his own games, but I suspect he probably was. That's a gut feeling. Matt Edmondson is a British DJ, Radio 1 DJ, who's got loads of games credited to him on the Board Game Geek website. Did Matt Edmondson create the games Noggin, Obama Llama, Rainbow Rage? Again, my gut feeling is he probably did, right? I don't think we've got celebrities as yet attached to board games and then being credited where they didn't actually design the game. What we do have in the board game industry is teams of designers where the individuals within that team aren't named. And so, the most famous example is Prospero Hall. So Prospero Hall is not a person. Prospero Hall is a group of designers that made a lot of IP-based games, things like the Back to the Future board game, the Jaws board game, and things like this. But these are modern games with a modern aesthetic coming out from companies like Ravensburger. And a lot of games made by Prospero Hall were made for Funko before Funko sold out to Goliath, and a lot of that Prospero Hall team was disbanded. But what you end up there is with games where the designer themselves, the individual who was heavily involved in that game, isn't necessarily credited. The credit goes to a group, and it can be hard to determine exactly who was involved in that process. Another example of that is Dobble, which was made by a company called Play Factory. Although if you look on the Board Game Geek website, there are names on there of exactly who those people are. And the game Ice Cool by Brain Games. So that is credited to Brian Gomez. Now, Brian Gomez is not an actual person. Brian Gomez is just a bit of a strange way of saying Brain Games. And so it's actually just the Brain Games team who came together to make that game. So I know the Brain Games team quite well, but I don't know who really had input into Ice Cool, their most popular game, even having worked with Brain Games on 3 games myself, Doodle Rush, Zingazam, and Pikoko. So sometimes designers go uncredited and they work as a collective. Then there's the instance of very, very prolific designers. So for example, Rainer Knizia. If you look in Rainer Knizia's rule books, he will always credit his playtesters, and he has clearly got a very close-knit team of playtesters who work on all of his games, or for a period of time they'll be working on all of his games. So you'll see the same names coming up time and time again. So it's a bit like a little development team. Now, this is not about casting any aspersions on anybody. I'm quite sure that Rainer Knizia has huge input and is the originator of all of his games, but there's no doubt there are other people there putting input into these games to some degree or other, and it's always difficult to determine when does playtester cross over into developer or even co-designer. And there are instances where some of those playtesters, for example Sebastian Bleasdale, gets credited as a co-designer along with Rainer Knizia on some games, or at least one game I'm aware of, but in others he's listed in the book as a playtester. Clearly it's of value to have Rainer Knizia's name on your box. Okay, Rainer Knizia is a selling point, is a brand, but I'm quite confident that Rainer Knizia is producing his own games. So that brings me on to developers in general. Very frequently a game will be submitted to a publisher. The publisher will do a lot of development work on that game, not necessarily with the designer's input, and then the game when it's released will be quite different to the game when it was first pitched to the publisher, and it may be that the designer has had very little input into that development process. In which case, you've got somebody there who has done as much as maybe a co-designer would have done if we had chosen to call them that, but they're credited as a developer or they're not credited at all. And then finally, I think there's the expansions and the sequels and the derivative works. So if I have a board game contract, it might have a clause in there, not always, but it might have a clause in there about derivative works. And what they're talking about there is expansions and sequels. And certainly in more than one of my contracts that I've had, there is a clause in there that says that if they go on, the publisher goes on to make a derivative work or an expansion, I will have first refusal on designing that expansion or derivative work. And if I choose not to do so, then they can hire somebody else to design that sequel or derivative work, but I will be paid a royalty for that, even if I wasn't involved at all in the development of that game or expansion. Now, I have not yet seen in a contract written that I would be credited for that derivative work, but I could easily imagine that it happens. So let's have a look at some examples of expansions and sequels where somebody new has been brought into the mix. So it's not just the original designer of the game, but there's somebody else involved. So an example would be the Takenoko sequel, Takenoko Chibis, which is credited to Antoine Bowser, who was the original designer of Takenoko, but also Corentin Lebrat, who is a frequent collaborator with Antoine Bowser. Now, I have no idea whether Antoine Bowser was involved in that expansion or not. He's credited, so we take it that he was. But it could be that Corentin Lebrat came in and did that expansion work and that Antoine Bowser's being given credit for it, which is quite right, frankly, because even if that was the case, that work is derivative of Antoine Bowser's original work. So I think they should be credited as co-designer, whether they had any involvement in that expansion or not. And I'll say again, I have no idea who had involvement in these expansions and who didn't. Another example would be Pandemic in the Lab. We've got Matt Leacock there, but as the original designer of Pandemic, but we've also got Tom Lehman, who is a prolific designer in his own right, coming in and working on that. Tom Lehman being the designer of Race for the Galaxy. But on that expansion, and on several of the Pandemic expansions, Tom Lehman is a collaborator. Now, was Matt Leacock involved in those expansions, or was that just Tom Lehman? I have no way of knowing. Roll for the Galaxy is a reimagining of Race for the Galaxy, but now using dice. I remember listening to an interview with Tom Lehman where that re-implementation was instigated by another designer who's called, I'm going to mispronounce this, I think, Wei Hua Huang, was the originator, the instigator of this dice game version of Race for the Galaxy. And I believe Tom Lehman clearly had involvement in it, but it's credited to both of them. Seven Wonders Duel has Antoine Bowser, and this time, from Seven Wonders was Antoine Bowser's game, but this time Bruno Cathala comes in as a co-designer for the two-player only version. So is that a case of Bruno Cathala coming in and doing the work and creating the game based off of Seven Wonders, or is this a case of the two of them coming together and sitting down and working? I don't know the answer to that. Carcassonne the Castle. Now, Carcassonne is a game by Klaus-Jürgen Raeder, but Carcassonne the Castle is designed by Rainer Knizia, co-designed, credited with Klaus-Jürgen Raeder. But is that because Klaus-Jürgen Raeder was the originator of the original game, or is that because they sat down together and made that sequel together? I don't know. I suspect in that version, that example, that it was probably Rainer Knizia's twist on Carcassonne, and that Klaus-Jürgen Raeder may not have had a huge amount of involvement, but I don't know. My Little Scythe, I thought, was an interesting example, because this one, this is a children's version, a junior version of Scythe. Scythe was by Jamie Stegmaier, but My Little Scythe was introduced to Stonemaier by a father and daughter team, Hobie and Vienna Chow. And the game is credited to Hobie and Vienna. There is no credit on there for Jamie Stegmaier as a co-designer, which I think would have been perfectly reasonable, even if he had no involvement in the design of the game. He designed the original game on which My Little Scythe is based, so that to me could be called a co-design, but he's not credited in that instance. And the final example is the Exit series. So Exit, the game, is a series of escape room games from Cosmos designed by Marcus and Inka Brand. And so the original episodes, they come out very frequently. It's an episodic release of these small box escape room games. But the later versions in the series don't just have Marcus and Inka Brand credited, they also have an in-house designer from Cosmos credited, which is Ralph Kayforth. I'm not familiar with this designer, but what is that person's involvement? Is it a case of Cosmos have taken some of those episodes in-house and designed them and just had the sign-off by Marcus and Inka? Or is it a case of the three of them sit down together and co-design? I don't know. So those are the examples that I can think of where you might have a designer credited who didn't actively work on the game. I'm not sure I'd go quite so far as to call them ghostwritten though. No game is unique, right, in 2024. There have been so many thousands and thousands of games that have gone before. I don't think anybody can confidently say that I've come up with something genuinely unique. You may well have done, but have you researched the thousands and thousands of games that have gone before just to double check? I don't think it's even possible to do that. So what we're looking for is something distinctive, something eye-catching, something that just feels a little bit different, a little bit special. So the next question comes from the same video, the one about getting noticed by publishers. And the question is, do you think it's a good idea to pitch your idea as X, but reimagined as Y? So poker, but it's a deck building game now. Or drawing comparisons to other games. It's like Monopoly, but mixed with Dungeons and Dragons. So first thing I'll say is, it's like Monopoly, but mixed with Dungeons and Dragons was the central hook from the designer of Talisman back in 1983. I've listened to interviews with this designer, and of course this was before, 1983 was way before we had these many modern board games around us. This was a hobbyist who loved Dungeons and Dragons, wanted to turn it into a board game, and his main source of reference was Monopoly. And so he went about trying to create Monopoly, but as a Dungeons and Dragons type setting, and of course over many versions it grew and expanded, and it became the game Talisman, which is still extremely successful and popular all around the world to this day. It can work, and there's an example of it working, but that was an example of taking a very famous game and mixing it with another very famous game. It wasn't so much about mixing mechanisms as taking two games and kind of smashing them together. I think the other example about poker, but now it's a deck building game, is a little bit more tricky, because that is going to work for some people but not for others. If you put that in front of just the general population, you said, right, this game is poker, but it's now a deck building game, you're going to find that the vast majority of people don't know what a deck building game is. They might not know how to play poker. They might already find poker quite complicated. And the idea of mixing it up is not going to appeal particularly to poker players. They don't really understand deck building. And so you've got a bit of a damp squib there. You've got a hook that isn't really going to, get its grip into anybody. You might find a publisher finds that intriguing. Okay, the idea of deck building, but it's also poker. I want to hear about this. I want to find out how this works, right? But it's probably not going to be your core hook when you get it out to an audience. Now, this can work if you're pitching your game to an audience of experienced gamers, right? So if you've got a group of very experienced gamers who understand what deck building is, right? And they understand other mechanisms, maybe it's area control, for example. And so you pitch it to them as, this is a deck building game, but it's also an area control game. Yes, suddenly you've got those experienced gamers interested. You are limiting your audience though, you're limiting your market, because you're gonna need people to understand what those terms mean. I mean, I've done it myself with the game Pikoko, for example, which is a trick-taking game, but you can't see your own cards. That's the hook. Now, if you don't know what a trick-taking game is, that hook's not really going to work for you. But it sure worked for publishers, and it worked at conventions where you had players who knew what that stuff was. I use a similar hook for my game Throne. Okay, so Throne is a trick-taking game, but it uses dice instead of cards. Now, that's a really good hook for a publisher, for a convention goer, for somebody who knows what trick-taking is. Not such a great hook for the general market, who just see that as, well, if I wanted to play a dice game, I'd like to play something a little bit simpler. And if I wanted to play a trick-taking game, I don't want something so random. And I don't even know what a trick-taking game is anyway, and so on. I've made whole videos about why the central hook to Throne didn't work so well. So I think you've got to be a bit careful with smashing together mechanisms. I think it's a great way of innovating and creating clever new systems, but it may not be your selling point. okay, because your selling point has to read easily to a mass audience. Designers throughout history were not blessed with thousands of new releases each year to learn from. They built games from scratch. In 2008, we hailed Donald X Vaccarino as a pioneer when he invented deck building. Someone, somewhere, invented playing cards, marbles, dice. Someone invented chess. And the comment specifically relates to 2 minutes and 19 seconds into the video. And the comment simply says, Richard Garfield spits his drink out of his nose. Okay, so Richard Garfield spits his drink out of his nose. Richard Garfield is the designer of Magic the Gathering, the collectible card game. And the originator, or certainly the person who popularized that system of randomized boosters and constructing your deck before you play to play against another player. And so that's presumably what this commenter is getting at. I describe deck building as having been invented by Donald X Vaccarino. So do I stand by that, or have I overlooked Richard Garfield? I've found this comment in many videos that I've made, any video I've made where I talk about Donald X Vaccarino as the inventor of deck building. I always get this comment about, oh yeah, okay, screw the Magic the Gathering players then, let's forget about them, let's forget about people who've been playing it since the 90s and so on. I'm really not forgetting about them, okay? I fully understand that Richard Garfield invented collectible card games, deck construction became a big thing because of Magic the Gathering, building a deck before you play, absolutely, let's credit that to Richard Garfield. He was an incredible innovator, did amazing things for the hobby. What Donald X Vaccarino did was heavily inspired by Magic the Gathering, playing lots of Magic the Gathering, but he took that deck construction and he turned it into an entire game, right? The game is the deck construction. That had not come about before. There are some types of drafts that are played within Magic the Gathering where you're kind of drafting the cards and playing the cards at the same time, building your deck and playing, you know, fine. But it's not the same as that core smooth system that Donald X Vaccarino introduced to the hobby, where we have a supply of cards, we're taking these cards, building our decks, and the whole game is trying to create a deck that's full of points. Right? Our own individual deck that's created throughout the game. So I think that's a different thing. Now that mechanism itself had been used before Dominion in the game StarCraft, the board game. But that was a much bigger game, came out maybe a year before Dominion or around the same time. It was probably in development around the same time as Dominion. But StarCraft, the board game, was a much bigger game with a tiny element of deck building in it. Whereas Dominion, that was the whole game. And every deck building game that came afterwards has a bit of Dominion's DNA in it, right? They were inspired by Dominion. They weren't inspired by StarCraft, the board game. And they weren't, I mean, I'm sure there was an inspiration coming in from Magic the Gathering. A lot of deck building players and designers will have played a lot of Magic the Gathering. But the core reference for them was Donald X Vaccarino's game Dominion. So an amazing innovator, Richard Garfield, another amazing innovator, Donald X Vaccarino, and I doubt very much whether Richard Garfield was watching my video, and if he was, I doubt very much that he was spitting his drink out of his nose. I'm sure he's heard of Dominion and Donald X Vaccarino before that video. So that brings me to a close. I hope you found some of that information useful. If you did, you might want to watch one of my other videos where I go through my YouTube comments and answer people's questions. I'm going to share links for a couple of them on the screen, so you might want to visit one of these videos next.